They are deceived, who flatter themselves that the ignorant and debased slave has no conception of the magnitude of his wrongs. They are deceived who imagine that he arises from his knees, with back lacerated and bleeding, cherishing only a spirit of meekness and forgiveness. A day may come, it will come, if his prayer is heard, a terrible day of vengeance, when the master in his turn will cry in vain for mercy. Powerful words from our old friend Solomon Northup in his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. You know, I had a thought when I was watching El Camino, the new Breaking Bad movie. Specifically, the scene where Todd Alquist goes to visit Jesse Pinkman in his cell. Jesse's been imprisoned by these neo-Nazis and forced to cook meth for them.
Guy on KOB keeps calling for rain. What do you think?
I don't know.
Guy said like 40% chance yesterday, 60% today.
There are more of these flashback scenes that show the neo-Nazis abusing Jesse in all sorts of horrible and extreme ways, but this scene really stood out to me as being especially creepy. The contrast between the banality of the conversation and the sheer fucked upness of the situation is almost comical. In Todd's mind, he's being kind to Jesse, but at the end of the day, of course, Jesse is his slave. This summer, when I criticized the movie Gods and Generals for being lost cause propaganda, many commenters rightly pointed out that my criticisms were not new. People were saying this stuff when the movie first came out. And at that time, Ron Maxwell, the director, actually responded to these claims in an article. Here's what he had to say about his portrayal of American slavery. This film, perhaps for the first time, captures the perniciousness of the institution of slavery. In Gods and Generals, we meet two Afro-Virginians who, despite being treated with respect and even love by their white masters, still have no confusion whatsoever about their desire to be free. Who among us would want to live in slavery, no matter how benign the immediate situation? This unusual cinematic treatment, though historically more typical of the Tidewater and Shenandoah Valley small-town relationships among blacks and whites during the war, was misinterpreted by these critics as glossing over slavery. Where were the floggings, the rapes, the chains? They obviously missed the point. There are many problems with that quote and the whole article generally, and I'll link to the full thing down below in the description if you're interested in checking it out. But my point in bringing it up is not to turn Maxwell into a punching bag again. My point here is that he is actually kind of right about one thing. The floggings, the rapes, the chains, this was not part of the day-to-day life of the majority of American slaves. The day-to-day reality was far less extreme, but just as horrifying in a lot of ways. The phrase, "the banality of evil," comes to mind, coined by a Jewish author to describe Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, during his trial in Jerusalem in the 60s, when he maintained, up until they hung him, that he was just doing his job and following orders. American masters did not treat their slaves with respect and even love. They certainly thought they did, but you didn't have to be John Brown to realize that it was all a delusion. It came from this twisted sense of paternalistic responsibility that was entirely self-serving. There's a famous quote from Robert E. Lee, where he describes slavery as a moral and political evil, but you don't often hear that he goes on to say in that same letter that the blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. When masters did treat their slaves well, truly well, by any standard, both then and now, of moral enlightenment, it was so staggeringly rare that it's barely even worth mentioning. Stonewall Jackson's wife, Anna, in her memoirs, described her late husband as a very kind master. But he was still the master, and as such, saw fit occasionally to discipline his slaves. Here's one disciplinary tactic that Anna says that Stonewall used. When a servant left a room without closing the door, he would wait until he had reached the kitchen, and then call him back to shut it, thereby giving him extra trouble, which generally ensured his remembrance the next time. It may seem like a small thing, but in my opinion, this quote really captures the banality of Stonewall Jackson's evil. Imagine for a second a situation in your own life where you don't have that much personal agency. This might be an easier mental exercise for some of us than others, but it could be at work or at school, just anywhere where you don't have that much control. Your boss wants you to do your job a certain way. Your teacher wants that assignment in by Wednesday, and oh, by the way, it has to be double-spaced. The good news is that in our lives, at least here in the developed world, when your shift ends, when the bell rings, you're back in control. Free to go to the bar and vent to your friends about your idiot boss and all the crap you had to go through at work. Even in the most benevolent of circumstances, American slaves never had that. Take that feeling of a lack of agency and control, and imagine that you have it every moment of every day, that you were born with it, and that you'll die with it. Then you'll have some tiny inkling of what it might have been like to be an American slave.